Welcome to the Daily Objective, day 109 of the war in Israel. We hear a lot about we've talked here as well about the suffering of the Palestinians. When you watch the news, that is mostly the story you hear about Palestinians living under war in Gaza, under bombardments by Israel, having been displaced from their homes. You don't hear much, at least in Western media, about the fact that Israel is also living in a time of war. Israelis are going through that, and that is a war that you also that not many people mention. Israel didn't actually start or choose. So we're going to talk about that today. I'm joined by Dr. Michael Kauffman. Michael Kauffman is the CEO of Nereid Therapeutics. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Beautifully.
And they are involved in cancer drug development. And Michael, are you in Tel Aviv right now?
Yeah, I'm in Tel Aviv now. I spend about half the time in Tel Aviv and the rest in America.
So I'll just start generally. What has it been like living in Israel in Tel Aviv since October 7th?
Yeah, so we were luckily, my family, we live in northern Tel Aviv. Luckily, we were outside the country on October 7th. We had actually boarded the Lufthansa flight from Austria back to Tel Aviv, and we were told to get off the plane that all flights to Israel were canceled. And then we heard about the war. We weren't able to get here for about 3 days because the majority of flights were canceled to Israel, and frankly, there were terrorists running around the country and nobody knew exactly where they were. We did get in about 3 days after the war started. It was, the airport was mostly empty. El Al, which is the Israeli airline, was the only one flying into Israel. There were a surprising number of foreigners, mostly Jewish, mostly Israel supporters, coming into the country, and many reservists from the Israeli Defense Force, which is the army, that were coming back into the country. And it was a bit ironic to see that because most countries in a wartime, you see a lot more people leaving, but there were a lot more people coming in. We felt it was our duty to come back. Also, my oldest son is in the reserves, and he was called up to the northern front because there was already some trouble there. The first week that we were back was pretty scary, actually. We were under constant missile attack, even in Tel Aviv, which requires longer range missiles from Gaza. 4 to 5 times a day, we were running into our safe room within our apartment. These are reinforced rooms that actually have protected air flow. We had barely internet service in there. And when the missile sirens are blowing, you have about 15 seconds to get into the room before the missile, if it does hit, will hit. Luckily, Israel has iron domes, not luckily, but with the great collaboration between Israel and the United States, they've developed remarkable anti-missile missiles, which is called Iron Dome, and there's another one called David Sling. And most of the rockets that come to Tel Aviv were taken out over the Mediterranean Sea. And you could hear a very loud bang. My 8-year-old daughter would start crying and screaming at times until she unfortunately got used to it after about a week, because it's a bit scary and it's pretty terrifying for the kids. The other big problem we had in the first week was that we didn't know it, but 3,500 terrorists had entered Israel, and their actual plans, which we learned later, were to come up and take over the country. We didn't know where they were. The Israeli Defense Force was very slow to respond to the initial attack. Really nothing happened for the first 6 to 8 hours. And it took literally 24 hours for the IDF to really get its act together. And there were terrorists still running around the country for a very long time. So it was a pretty scary time.
Yeah. Again, we don't hear much about this, but kids in Israel are growing up with these loud explosions because yeah, when a rocket is shot down, there is an explosion, and these are not the most sophisticated rockets, which of course makes for some people makes the Palestinians the people to support because they're not as advanced. But yeah, those rockets the rockets started sometime, I think, in the early 2000s, and they were targeted at some of the settlements within the Gaza Strip, some of the villages and towns around the Gaza Strip. And since Israel left, they became better at it. And yeah, those are, uh, first of all, they're dangerous. Second of all, yeah, this is what kids in Israel are growing up with. And again, through the choice of the Palestinians, which is not something that is very often reported. So we're talking today on the what is it, 23rd of January. Today was one of the worst days for Israel in the ground operation. 21 soldiers died in an operation. They died because they went into a building and they basically went into an ambush in that building. Now, Israel does these sort of operations knowing that soldiers are likely to die, when it could be done without the soldier's death, but with the risk of casualties on the Palestinian side. Um, what do you think about that? What is the sentiment generally in Israel when something like this happens? Do you hear voices saying, why were they there? Why was this not done from the air?
Yeah, I think one of the greatest unfortunate things about the most Western media and the portrayal of the entire war is this notion that somehow Israel is not careful, and this notion that somehow they indiscriminately bomb people. Let's be very clear. If Israel wanted to, Gaza would be a parking lot within a week. Let me say that again. The Israeli Air Force is second probably only to the United States Air Force in the entire world. If Israel wanted to, Gaza would not exist anymore, except underground where the terrorists are hiding. Israel has been incredibly careful and has lost over 213 soldiers now. These are almost all young people between the ages of 18 and 28, for the vast majority of them, because they're trying not to do that. They are not indiscriminately bombing the strip, and they are trying to do very careful operations, which is exactly what Razi was talking about. This particular incident, which is a tragedy, terrible tragedy, was only because they wanted to take down these buildings which are used by Hamas. And there's a great network of buildings and tunnels that are used by Hamas for one goal, and that is to eliminate Israel. And they went into those buildings to level the buildings and make sure that there were no civilians in the buildings as well. And when they see civilians, they ask them to leave. They actually send out messages. They speak Arabic, etc. And they say to get out of there because it's a dangerous zone. And they were trying to eliminate these buildings. And unfortunately, effectively became an ambush. The Israeli army in the past used to actually drop leaflets on buildings and also send in small, what are sort of knocking devices, basically a tiny little bomb that would not penetrate anything but would leave a loud bump on the building so that anybody inside could leave, including the terrorists. And the entire goal that Israel used to have before the October 7th massacre occurred was to try to save as many civilians as possible, even though they knew they were alerting the terrorists as well, by doing this knocking. Because of the anger and frustration and disgust and depression following October 7th, this particular maneuver, which is not used by any other army in the world, by the way, and never has been, only by Israel, this was abandoned. But they still drop leaflets all the time. They have humanitarian corridors, etc. Ironically, Syria, where the giant civil war has been going on and there are 500,000 dead Muslims, certainly nowhere anywhere in Russia or Ukraine are any of these considerations. And obviously the world has had no issue with what has gone on those other places, but somehow it's become Israel's so-called fault because civilians are killed. I did neglect to mention, because I was giving a Tel Aviv view just at the beginning, and Razi, you mentioned it, there are 200,000 Israelis who do not live in their homes right now. That includes about 40% of them, I believe, are in the communities surrounding Gaza. where these communities are completely ghost towns now because they're just too dangerous, even today. And in a lot of people in the north, where Hezbollah is attacking intermittently and has led to many towns being uninhabitable there as well. Nobody seems to care that there are 200,000 Israelis that are completely displaced, even by the victor, etc., and they cannot go back. And Israel has, every government has a job to protect their citizens. Israel will take action to make sure that those citizens can return safely to their homes. If that means eliminating every Gaza terrorist or all of Hezbollah, if that's what it takes to make those parts of the country habitable, then that's what they will do. And by the way, I think for everybody living outside of Israel, if your government allowed your house to be bombed regularly, I think you probably have a pretty strong opinion that they should do what it takes to make sure that can't happen. But I'm sorry I neglected to mention that at the beginning. Back to the last bit, and I'll just close with saying we have lost a lot of young people here. Israel, much more so than the United States. Every time we lose a soldier, the pictures of the families, they're on the news. There is a great deal of crying and sadness and increased frustration with both Hamas, Hezbollah, and in general, the whole world's response to this, that why young people who have done nothing but defend the country should have to die needlessly in all of this. That's besides what happened on the 7th of October, which initiated this. And I'll just remind people lastly that we did have a ceasefire. On October 6th, there was a ceasefire. October 7th changed everything, and I really believe that Israel is doing what it can, I think way beyond what it should do. I personally, as an American, think Israel is way too careful. And I think when you're in a war and when people have not only killed, maimed, raped, beheaded your citizens, but actually taken hostages, which is a violation of every law of war in the world. And they're not, and by the way, Hamas is not in front of the International Court, but if someone does that to you, then I think you should be a lot harsher in your response. And let's face it, when countries elect, and Hamas was elected, when countries elect a government and that government behaves badly or causes you harm, that's the government's fault. That's not the people that they harmed.
Thank you, Stephen, for the super chat. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Bonnie, for your super chats. Yeah, on that point, so I was looking today at Owen Jones, a famous left-wing journalist in the UK, who we mention here frequently, and by we I mean I mention frequently. So today he was talking about these buildings where the soldiers died and how Israel is at fault basically because these are civilian buildings that they were going in order to take down, which is a war crime or something of the sort. Now, again, this was an ambush. So some of what he said was the argument that this is a civilian building that is used can be said about any building. But it can be said about any building, and it would be correct. This is what Hamas does. There is seemingly nothing that Israel can do except, lay down and die that would be acceptable to much of the world. So what is the purpose on Israel's part of trying so hard to avoid civilian casualties on the Palestinian side, knowing that soldiers would die, B, knowing that the Palestinian people are behind this. This was not something that Hamas did against the will of the people. They participated in October 7th. They celebrated on the streets. What is the point? And is this actually an effective way to achieve the goals, or is it counterintuitive?
Well, a couple of points. The first one is, and I, as an American who also now has Israeli citizenship, married to an Israeli with dual citizenship children, I believe that Israel is too careful. everything I've grown up to believe, everything that the United States has done in pretty much every war that the United States has participated in, including World War II, where we annihilated Germany. And there are cities in Germany like Frankfurt and others that were leveled completely. You go to Frankfurt, there are no old buildings because there was nothing left. And you go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, where we obviously dropped atomic weapons, which stopped that war. And I support all of those moves. Now, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there today who believe that we were disproportionate. But I think when people are driving, flying planes into your ships, which is what the Japanese kamikazes were doing, or what the Germans did to not only the Jews, but to gypsies, gays, etc., annihilating those in concentration camps. Again, it's a war. It's either you or me. And I think the Israelis are some of the most careful people when it comes to all of this. And they don't do it to appease the world. They do it because it's part of Judaism. The loss of any life, assuming it's not a life that is pointing a gun at your head, is of concern to them. And I get into many arguments here in Israel with people about the restraint that the Israeli Defense Forces put on its soldiers in doing what it's doing. I don't agree with it, but it's something that they do because that's part of the culture here, and they do recognize that life is important. They really do. And that's one of the reasons you see pictures of soldiers up, which we don't do in America very often. We certainly didn't do it during Afghanistan and Iraq, which were our two largest wars recently. And we couldn't do it clearly in Vietnam and in Korea because of the great divisions within our country to do it. But the Israelis do, and they're very concerned about this. I think the arguments. Look, I have a very strong opinion, and I just don't understand, frankly, most of the criticism about Israel. I think October 7th, there is good and there is evil. Nothing could justify what happened on October 7th. When there are always, two sides to every issue, and one side is right, and the other one is, in this case, just pure evil. Hamas treats its people terribly. They treat the women terribly. They behead or throw gays off of buildings. Anybody who doesn't agree, there are no Christians to speak of in Gaza because they were eliminated or kicked out. Just like there are very few Christians left, frankly, in Lebanon, and certainly very, very few in South Lebanon, which is mostly controlled by Hezbollah. It is shocking to me, anybody that could support Hamas, because let's start with the foundation of Hamas. The foundation is that they don't recognize the existence or the right of Israel to exist, that from the river to the sea means from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which means there is no country of Israel anymore. And when someone basically says, I don't recognize the right of your country to exist, they have declared de facto war on you. So once somebody declares war on you, you have every right to defend yourself to the extent that you need to. The second part of it is that's the foundation of Hamas. Where are they headed? Let's assume that Hamas had a state. What would the state look like in 10 years? At best, it would look like Iran. This is what every person who supports Hamas wants to see happen. They want a caliphate. Hamas, if they could ever create a country, and I don't think they can, because all I think they can do is military and terrorism. But if they could, it would look like Iran. I don't want to live in a world of Iran. I don't think we need Iran in the world. If Iran went away tomorrow, nothing would happen. The world wouldn't miss a thing. We would have a lot more money to put into good things like education and healthcare and food instead of defending against terrorism, because Iran sponsors all the terrorism. So I don't understand the people that support Hamas. The last bit, and I really don't think there are two sides to this argument. There's one side. Hamas is not allowed to use United Nations buildings to put military equipment. They're not allowed. That's illegal. That's against the United Nations Charter. It's against the UNRWA Charter, et cetera, et cetera. Hamas does do that. We found many examples of United Nations buildings that house weapons. Hamas is not permitted to put weapons in hospitals. Well, we've seen time and again that actually the majority of the Hamas major weapons areas are either in or below the hospitals, which is completely illegal and which everyone seems to forget. Never mind the fact that they shot off an Ayn missile that killed a bunch of their civilians. Israel was originally blamed in some of the worst reporting in modern history. The notion you could count 500 bodies within 5 minutes. Never mind the fact that the missile didn't even come from the air; it came from the ground, and that still hasn't been corrected by many of the people that were gleefully reporting that this was Israel's massacre of Palestinian civilians. By the way, the 50 or so Palestinian civilians that were killed by the Islamic Jihad missile, that is not considered a massacre. That's just fine. The world has never condemned Islamic Jihad for that. I've never heard it anywhere. And lastly, you're not allowed to put any weapons in schools. And yet we know day in and day out that many, many schools have weapons. Hospitals, schools, United Nations buildings. There are no civilian structures. There are also homes. We've seen pictures of kids' rooms with dolls that are where missiles are in and bombs are inside the dolls. I mean, there are no buildings in Palestine, so-called, or in Gaza, where there are no military equipment. Every single building is a potential source of military equipment. The notion that there's any difference between civilian buildings and military Hamas terrorist buildings is ridiculous, and frankly could only be applied to Israel, because no one would dare tell the United States that we, ever dropped bombs, or certainly not give them a hard time, give the US a hard time. Never mind Russia, Ukraine, and the Syrian civil war, and so on and so forth. So I think one of the things that we all ought to do when we hear these arguments is to stop allowing this kind of door opening policy that we have, which is to allow people to come in sort of on the side and kind of squeak in through some ridiculous notion that Israel might have messed up once or twice. Of course it did. It's a war. Every country messes up once or twice. But we're fighting people that put babies in front of them as shields. And you're right, Razi, the only other option would be for Israel to lay down and die. And that isn't going to happen.
Yeah, I have to say, I think you were taking it easy on the UN and UNRWA. So, by the way, anybody here who hasn't seen our episode, UNRWA is Hamas, Daniel will put a link to it either in the live chat or in the description or both. But yeah, UNRWA is completely controlled by Hamas. It is locals who work there. Those locals will not be able to work there without the approval of Hamas. So it is a Hamas wing. It is the wing of Hamas that is funded by American taxpayers, essentially. So yeah, it is an entity that needs to be dismantled as well as part of if anything is going to change there.
Razi, maybe I'm trying to one-up you on this, but I think one of the things you learn in science and medicine, and I'm not trying to take the high road here too much, but the word United Nations, let's dissect that for 2 seconds. This is an absurd notion. If the nations were truly united, the majority of the United Nations, the nations that are in the UN, are not democracies. There's nothing united about them. They are mostly non-democratic places that are ruled by autocracy, theocracy, or by just thugs. And they're not united. There's no even in the Security Council, the highest body within the United Nations, you have Russia and China with the United States and 2 of its allies. It's absurd. The name United Nations is a misnomer. It would be like saying that there's a good kind of cancer. There's no good cancer.
Yeah, by the way, when we talk about the UN, please always try to one-up me when I criticize them. That is, I don't think you can criticize them strongly enough. By the way, on this channel, we have suggested when people ask, what should be done. First of all, the US pays 25% of their budget cut that immediately, kick them out. And I've also suggested there's this, do you know this building in Pyongyang that looks kind of like an arrow, was built as a hotel, is really a tall skyscraper and is empty because as they do in communist countries, they built it to give people jobs or whatever, and it's empty. That can be the new United Nations headquarters. I think that's the perfect place for it. We have a super chat from Dean. Thank you, Dean. The question is, hey, Razi and Michael, is it possible to make a deal with Hamas for hostages, get them back, and then kill the terrorists you released? Not that Israel would ever have the balls to make this move. First of all, I can see why your super chat wasn't allowed. The word balls, I'm guessing, is the reason, but we can read that here. Michael, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, Israel just sent a deal offer for a 2-month stay of the fighting, and very likely Hamas will or has part or all of it will or has escaped through the Egyptian Rafah crossing. That's the other great. We didn't cover that, but everyone should remember that the other crossing and where all the weapons come in is through Egypt. Even though Egypt is supposedly in a peace treaty with Israel, Egypt has allowed all the weapons to come in to Hamas, et cetera, et cetera. But we just offered that to get the hostages back, and they said absolutely not. These people will allow all of their citizens to die. They will allow the food to run out. They will allow the water to run out. And Israel has allowed humanitarian aid, which is far greater than most conflicts in the world. I mean, the conflicts that are ongoing now in Africa, for example, there's no humanitarian aid, there's famine. And nobody is screaming about that. You don't see protesters screaming about that. Hamas has no interest in life. And I think you all have to remember, we as Westerners often, we walk into a lion's den and we think if we're just going to talk to the lion nicely, the lion will behave in a civilized fashion, which may be true up to a point. But at some point, the lion decides it's hungry and all civility ends and you end up being eaten. We are applying the wrong values to people that don't respect life. If someone doesn't respect life, then you cannot reason with them. And we have made this mistake, and especially on the left, for a very long time, and we continue to make it. It seems the more 9/11s we have and the more underground bombings there are in Britain and other places, and the more ISIS we have, and frankly, Boko Haram and Hezbollah and Hamas and Houthis and everybody, it seems like we all want to embrace these people and just talk to them like civilized folks. And it's crazy. I don't believe that beating Hamas and getting the hostages back are compatible with each other. That's my own personal belief. There's a growing number of people. The Israeli Defense Force has now started to come to that, I think, realization that Hamas will fight until they all are killed and get to go up to heaven, get their 72 virgins. And I'm not making this up. This is their own language. And, meet Allah and get their 72 virgins. And this is the death cult that is Hamas. Remember what Hamas has done with the anywhere between 15 to 30 billion dollars in aid that has come in, that we know of, that has come into the Palestinian Authority and into Gaza. They have spent the vast majority of it on tunnels, which are the best in the world, and missiles. And why anybody thinks they would change that and suddenly decide that they want to build a real life for the Palestinians is beyond me.
Yeah, I also agree, Dean. I don't see it happening. If you release them into a few buses and then they release the hostages and then you bomb those buses, that's great. That Hamas wouldn't agree to such a deal because they would know there's a risk. So they know how to work these deals in a way that it's not possible. You could just release them into Gaza and then flatten Gaza, but I don't think Israel is going to do that either. So we are out of time. The reality show starts right after we go off the air here. Today's topic is the two-state solution. Michael, thank you very much for joining me. Where can people find out more about you?
I think probably LinkedIn is probably the most about me. Look for Michael Kauffman. Boston and Miami drug developer, and Nereid, Nereid Therapeutics.
Thanks, Michael. I hope to see you back on the
Chris.
channel soon. And yeah, the reality show starts in about a minute. Thanks.